Welcome to Modern Anarchy, the podcast exploring sex, relationships, and liberation. I'm your host, Nicole.
I tried to keep her quiet, but she's screaming inside of me. I tried to keep her hiding, oh, shut up. I tried to keep her quiet, but she's a wild, wild woman.
On today's episode, we have Geoff join us for a conversation about embodying the values of anarchy. Together, we talk about bypassing versus integrating, practicing prefigurative politics, and writing thicker narratives. Hello, dear listener, and welcome back to Modern Anarchy. I am so delighted to have all of you pleasure activists from around the world tuning in for another episode each Wednesday. My name is Nicole. I am a sex and relationship psychotherapist with training in psychedelic integration therapy. And I am also the founder of the Pleasure Practice, supporting individuals in crafting expansive sex lives and intimate relationships. Dear listener, wow, this is such a special episode to be sharing with all of you. Geoff is one of my mentors and supervisors at Sauna Healing Collective, which is where truly I learned everything that I do know about psychedelics. And so, dear listener, you have heard me talk about the frameworks of liberation with psychedelics and the politics of it all and the clinical healing. And today's episode is definitely honoring all of the training that I've learned from Geoff and from the whole Sauna Healing Collective team. And it's really exciting to be sharing this with you because you know, dear listener, that I'm always talking about what it means to be in community, how we grow, heal, and learn in community. And so to be sharing one of my community members and someone that I've learned so much from, it's really powerful to be sharing this with all of you listeners. And I'm really excited to say that I am doing my postdoc at Sauna Healing Collective. And so if you want to learn more about psychedelic integration therapy, ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, talk therapy, the consultation groups that we run at Sauna Healing Collective with Geoff, I, and the whole team, I highly recommend going to check out saunahealingcollective.org, which will be linked in the show notes below. And yeah, dear listeners, so much more to come in this space, so much more to come. And I recorded this just before I was going on my internship, right at the end of my practicum training. And it's a really beautiful time capsule and reminder of all of the things that I learned in my training and everything I'm bringing back to my postdoc with sauna. And so excited to be on this journey with you, dear listener, and getting to share these powerful, powerful episodes with you each Wednesday. All right, dear listener, if you are ready to liberate your pleasure, you can explore my offerings and resources at modernanarchypodcast.com, linked in the show notes below. And I want to say the biggest thank you to all of my Patreon members. You are supporting the long-term sustainability of the podcast, keeping this content free and accessible to all people. So thank you. If you want to join the Patreon community, get exclusive access into my research and personal exploration, you can head on over to patreon.com/modernanarchypodcast, also linked in the show notes below. And with that, dear listener, please know that I'm sending you all my love, and let's tune in to today's episode. And then the first question I ask each guest is, how would you introduce yourself to the listeners?
Yeah, so I do a lot of different things, or have done a lot of different things over time. I've been a professor. I'm not currently. I have been a researcher. I'm not currently doing much with research. I have been an advocate and done policy work, which I'm still doing. I co-founded a nonprofit organization called Sana Healing Collective, which is where I moved away from some other things to focus on that. And we provide ketamine-assisted therapy and psychedelic integration. And we work to incorporate other psychedelics as they become available. So that'll change over time.
Yeah. Well, it's a joy to have you on the podcast space. You have also been my mentor and my supervisor in that space at Sauna. So I can definitely get emotional about the joys of having you in this space and everything that I've learned from you. And it's so special, I think, to have you on the podcast, particularly because I've talked so much about psychedelics and learning from Sauna Healing Collective and you and everyone there. So it's such a joy to get to have you here and share more of you with all the listeners on the podcast.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Appreciate that. And it's been a joy to learn a lot from you as well. And look forward to seeing where this conversation goes.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit more about your work with psychedelics.
So I started in about 2016 offering some psychedelic integration, and about 2017 starting to go with my clients to their ketamine infusions to different clinics. And so that's really where it started in the work for me. And around that time in 2017 as well, started offering a free open monthly meeting called Psychedelic Safety Support and Integration, which you can find on Facebook. There's no webpage, just a Facebook page where we post the monthly event. But the idea there was we were seeing a lot of people not have good access to information within the context of the war on drugs, and sometimes doing riskier things or having unrealistic expectations for what psychedelics could do given the context they were using them in. And so, really understandable given the kind of propagandized harm and then the counter efforts to highlight what the best case scenarios could be that people were often kind of missing what the average or typical experiences could be, or what they were more likely to be, and how to best facilitate those. So it's very drug focused narrative either way, and kind of leaving out set and setting. And so the idea was to bring in some psychoeducation, also to bring in community building. A lot of people just didn't have other people to talk to about these things who would be understanding of it. So even if they had a great experience, people would treat it like it was just abnormal or they're delusional or something, and then to give people a space to do some integration, which is the post psychedelic processing of the experiences.
Yeah, there was definitely parts of me in terms of preparing for this conversation where I was thinking, what could we share? After training with you and everyone for the last 2 years, how could we condense some of the most important pieces into, a bite-size discussion? And I think you've already hit on a couple of those things: the set and setting, the narrative, and the integration. And I'm curious if there's anything more that you'd want to share for the listeners who might not be as familiar with those concepts. And I know we could spend hours talking about it, which is the joy of it all. But are there some things that you would want to impart the listeners with that you think would be helpful, that you've learned over the years?
Yeah. So if I take a step back first, these projects are pretty political too, right? So, so there's also the equity and access and justice issues that go into this. That these are medicines that have been used by humans for thousands of years, that continue to be used in a handful of indigenous cultures uninterrupted during that time period. And so so where this information comes from is really important. What we do with that information is important. And, so there are all kinds of considerations to be made around things like appropriation, and are the cultures that we're learning from getting any benefit, or are they primarily getting harmed as we expand psychedelics? And so starting our organization, Sana Healing Collective, is a nonprofit and is an organization that is non-hierarchical in leadership, works by consensus. That was all an important consideration in it too, given that the nature of things is such that psychedelics are formed in a fairly elite, exclusionary, white and wealthy dominated way. And that's partly to do with the war on drugs, and not being able to get any federal funding for research, for example, so having to rely on wealthy philanthropy and private donors, right? So there's all this context to it as well. But so those are all part of the picture. But I think maybe the first thing I'll throw out there, just for some discussion around integration, is there's this critique that in the West we're already pretty disintegrated and out of balance and non-holistic in how we approach things. And so even as we have in philosophy rejected mind-body dualism. In practice, not so much. So our medical system is very mind-body dualistic. Your physician is very unlikely to ever ask you anything about your stress level or mental health, aside from maybe a brief screening measure or a non-trauma informed series of questions about your trauma history. And they're still very much not trained in that area. And so, if anything, it seems like healthcare is moving towards more and more silos and people specializing down to micro levels and things. And so I don't necessarily see that improving. I see that largely getting worse in the past decade, even as we've had these calls for like a biopsychosocial spiritual model and things that sound more holistic and integrated, but really are still about like trying to piece back together these things that are researched very separately. And so it's like if I sometimes give the metaphor of like, even if you had all the ingredients to a chocolate chip cookie, if you just throw them in a bowl together without knowing how to cook them, it's not going to taste anything like a chocolate chip cookie.
It's a good metaphor.
And so if we don't kind of have all these things equal and mixed together and baked in the right way, even having all these different silos of information don't get us any closer to holistic understanding of people.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And so that touches into integration, right? So given that we have all these ways that we categorize and compartmentalize and create dualities, mind, body, person, environment, it's very black and white and binary in our thinking in many ways, around gender, on sexuality, around in all these different ways, that how can people in this culture be anything but kind of fragmented and unintegrated. And so the question is, I think normally when we talk about psychedelic integration, we're thinking about you have this psychedelic experience and you have to find a way to kind of process it and integrate that into your life, into your mental health. And same would be true of talk therapy, right? You have an insight, it doesn't necessarily change your life. You got to figure out what do you do with that and how do you respond to that insight. And so I think that often what we do, because we're so disintegrated in the first place, is we try to not change ourselves by integrating that experience, but take the bits of the experience that fit within our current lives and then set aside the rest, right?
Yeah.
So if we discover that our work or our relationships or our lifestyle really aren't suiting us, those are big things to change and might be impossible to change depending on your context, and at least in the short term. And so it's easier to kind of take the more palatable and easy to integrate pieces and kind of try to push aside the rest.
Right.
And culturally, you could ask if we're doing that. So are we really shifting our culture with the insights that we would get from psychedelics? Or are we trying to accommodate it into capitalistic business models and kind of pharmaceutical patents and all these type of things?
Yeah.
So are we bypassing or are we integrating is the question to be asking ourselves as individuals and collectively to ask ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. The yes and to the scary and the beautiful journeys. And I think in terms of training at Sana for the last 2 years, it's been interesting to think about all of the other metaphorically psychedelic experiences that we have and how you can apply some of these same frameworks across the board to different experiences. I think definitely in this space, I've talked a lot about, points of expansion in terms of sexuality. You have that first kink scene, you have that first threesome, you have that first non-monogamous experience, and how these two are psychedelic paradigm shifts that you then can integrate into your life moving forward. Ideally, right? Whether it was a difficult experience or a really joyful one, what are you taking from that to move forward? I think another example is even like death in our culture, right? That's a pretty big paradigm psychedelic experience. And how are we integrating that into our life moving forward? And so I think it's been really interesting to see how the paradigms of psychedelics and how we integrate that is also applicable to other really sort of life paradigm shifting experiences and how we can learn from that framework.
Right. Yeah. And there too, right? Like there's this great Terence McKenna quote I was looking up here that so it's not a new idea. He died 25 years ago or something, but so the famous person in relation to psychedelics, but he said that the problem is not to find the answer, the problem is to face the answer. And so I think that's kind of speaks to what we were talking about there. It's like, we often as therapists help people kind of find answers, gain insight into things, but then, what do we do with that? That's actually where the harder part comes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think one of the biggest pieces is remembering that it's all about the community. That's one of,
Yeah.
the biggest pieces of sauna is that, say I had trained in a space where it was very capitalistic and hierarchical, I would have had a very different perspective to psychedelics. And that's often what we see, right? Is you can have that sort of experience, I've joked on the podcast, be surrounded by business bros and then say, how do we capitalize on this and make it really expensive so we can make money off of it, right? So remembering that, the psychedelic itself is not always going to necessarily give us these insights as much as it is the community that is around you when you are integrating the experience or even preparing.
Yeah. 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 What you said there is like this culture under capitalism has, and under states in general, like you don't need even if it wasn't capitalist, maintain all sorts of tools and strategies to kind of put you back to sleep should you wake up a little bit.
Yeah.
So right. So it's like we go from had this transcendent experience with whatever, with a psychedelic or somewhere else in life. And then how do we extract from that and monetize it? Right. So it's very quickly we'll kind of, and you'll see too, right? As you form an expertise in an area, people will kind of see things within you that knowledge within you that they could extract from too. And so you'll have weird interactions the more you learn about something.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we're talking a little bit about the set and setting, which I know I've talked to you about. Where do we draw the line when your mindset is inherently relational, or at least I see it as inherently relational, right? Where do we draw the line between the two? But talking about the settings of our culture and how that impacts our experience. And I'm curious if this could maybe be a point to explore the concepts of non-specific amplifier. And I know I've heard you talk a lot about also the ways that psychedelics specifically amplify imbalances. And so maybe we could talk a little bit more about your theories with that.
Yeah, in my understanding, they've heard the non-specific amplifier idea thrown out in a lot of different contexts, where sometimes it's hard for me to know what people mean when they're saying that, right? And so, but I think it that idea kind of came out as a critique to the idea that we should just put LSD in the water and everyone would be great, right? So so that would be implying that they're going to amplify the good, they're going to amplify our best attributes if we could just put it in the water. And so I think the non-specific amplifier is a good critique of that idea. That would go in a bad direction for some people, maybe for a lot of people, because we wouldn't have the set and setting to prepare for it. Right. And so I think the non-specific amplifier idea in that context, means that it might just kind of amplify the things that are already part of your set, that you're already kind of on your mind, that are in your immediate circumstances. And so if that's not a context or a preparation that supports kind of a beneficial psychedelic experience, and you might not have a beneficial experience, right? So in that sense, I kind of agree with it. I also think that psychedelics, though, do amplify the things that we bring into our set and settings, the things that we prepare ourselves with, kind of outside of ourselves and within ourselves. And so in that sense, I think they're not non-specific. I think they will amplify the things that are kind of most front of mind or most present in front of you. And so if we can create a good healing context with support and trust and integrity, then those things are likely to be amplified. If you have experiences in nature, then your connection to nature is likely to be amplified. Or if you just kind of, have engaged ideas or symbols of nature, like having flowers around you or pictures of nature or something. So I do think those things then will get amplified. And so I guess, one person might say that's non-specific in the sense that it could have been anything. If we put images of war, that would get amplified, right?
Yeah.
But, so it might just be kind of more language than anything, where I would say that it makes it not so non-specific.
Yeah, I know we've talked about how it amplifies attachment feelings, right?
Yeah. There's perspectives that an article that's kind of elicited a lot of debate about, like authoritarianism in relation to psychedelics, and I think that's where they were stretching the non-specific amplifier a little bit too far for me. That you don't see any authoritarian dictators dosing their populations with psychedelics. I think that would be an incredibly bad thing to do, because they are kind of disruptive, and if you're wanting a narrow single story ideology, they will not amplify that. Like I think that's super unlikely. Even if maybe the odd cult leader has been able to bring some people into whatever their beliefs are and control. Sure. It's more about power than anything else there.
Right. Yeah. Disruptors, highlighting the imbalances. I think this is where also maybe the metaphor of your inner healing wisdom could be important, right? I know that's something that we definitely talk a lot about at sauna, right? That trusting of the same ways that your body knows how to heal after a scar, right? And it can naturally have that sort of healing experience going into the psychedelic with the same sort of framework, right? Of trusting that what is coming up is for your healing, but of course that's within the specific container, I guess, of a therapeutic or healing sort of scenario.
Yeah, and there, I mean, that also challenges the non-specific amplifier, right? If you think that our bodies and our minds don't work in random ways, we wouldn't have evolved to, our bodies don't randomly just misfire, totally contextualized to like all sorts of things, the type of nutrients I'm taking in, the exercise I get. So it's not that things don't go wrong in the body, they do, but often there's always there's an explanation for that, right? Like if you had a house plant that was dying, you wouldn't assume the house plant was defective. You would assume something's off with the nutrients or the watering schedule or the sunlight. Plants are simpler than humans. They don't have as many needs. So it's easy for us to see that. But, humans exist within the range of possibilities, the conditions that are presented to them, whether physical body or mind. Yeah.
Right. And I feel like one of the questions I'd always get with people who are asking more about psychedelics are, what's the difference between all of them? We have all these different types of psychedelics and, they do amplify different things, right? Whether it's somatically, or various mind states. But you would always talk about psychedelics as the multiple doors to the same consciousness is what I've heard learning from you. So I'm curious.
Talking about different substances.
Yeah. Because it is true that, if we say, oh, non-specific amplifier, which we just spent a little bit more time unpacking, the experience of MDMA is different than ketamine. It is a quite literally different somatic experience and also a different mental experience. So that non-specific amplifier doesn't really get into the unique experiences of all the different types of psychedelics. But I would always hear you talk about how, they're different doors to a similar space of consciousness.
Yeah, I think so. I think and so what I'm really saying with that is I don't think that the molecular level stuff and neurotransmitter level stuff is the most important thing. I think it's an experience with an altered state of consciousnness that is where a lot of the novelty and benefit of psychedelics comes from. And so sometimes I'll say that the particular drug isn't so important as I think of those maybe as just different doorways into an altered state of consciousness. They all have their own feel, and we may be more comfortable with different substances because of that feel. That's more individual, kind of personal level. But I don't think we'll ever get to a point where we can just say this drug is good for this condition, even though that's kind of what FDA demands. Like you have to research a substance for a specific condition, one condition. And so it looks like MDMA is the PTSD drug and psilocybin is the depression drug and so on and so forth, right? But that's just kind of an artifact of FDA process that you have to pick a condition and research it for that. And so, like, for example, what you find out of the MDMA studies is they also had a pretty substantial impact on substance use and depression, but those were not the primary outcome measure. And so I think of psychedelics in general as being very good disruptors of our patterns. So if I have a pattern of thought or an emotional pattern or relational pattern or particular things that triggered me or behavioral pattern, that's really good at, so that is representative at the neuro level, right? We have pathways that kind of support that make it hard to go in a different direction once the train leaves the station, once you're on that track. And I think, psychedelics put a lot of switches on the track. And now you have the option to kind of get off that track and go in a different direction.
Yeah.
And literally you see that in the neuroimaging, it hyperconnects the brain. And so metaphorically, I think of it that way, is that psychedelics are really good just disruptors, and most of the things that people come to therapy for involve being stuck.
Right.
On a single track of behavior, thought, emotion, relationship pattern, etc. It's good at letting you jump tracks and kind of consider some other things, get some different perspectives is another way to think about it.
Shaking up the snow globe and having a different
the fresh snowfall.
Exactly.
Cover up all those footprints and tracks that you can go some new places. Those are helpful metaphors, but just recognizing those are kind of simplifications of everything that's going on there, but they're helpful to kind of understand what you can expect.
And I think an important piece of this conversation too, and training with you over the last 2 years is also the somatic piece. I feel like there's often this discussion of psychedelics as being, so cognitive, going into a purely cognitive healing experience. And I've definitely talked to you a lot about, the benefits of trying to turn off the cognitive and actually feel the amplification of your somatic experience on a quieting of the mind and actually feeling the sensation. So I'm curious what you would say to the somatic experience of psychedelics as well and the healing benefit there.
Yeah. And by the way, I know I go on tangents, so feel free to call back to any question if I miss major parts of it, which I know I will. But,
no, that's okay. We're human. We're here. It's a conversation.
But yeah, with the somatic, so if we're kind of thinking more holistically, I think psychedelics are things that can be helpful in disrupting these artificial dualisms that we've created, right? And so that the mind-body dualism is one of those dualisms. Self and other is another, so yeah, we can start with the somatic, but the first time I did a topic on psychedelics in the body it was for our free monthly group that I mentioned, and it was the biggest turnout we'd ever had for a topic. Cool. So normally we'd get maybe up to 20 people, and we probably had 40 or 50 or something for that one. And I just remember asking at the start, how many of you have ever had something interesting happen with mind body connection? And it's like everyone raised their hand. I mean, that's why they were there, right? But,
right.
And so I think we start from realizing this is one of the ways that we're coming in disintegrated, right? Is that we're kind of trained not to pay as much attention to the body. Certainly if there's a conflict between mind and body, to kind of ignore the body, right? Rather than treat that as a really important source of information and kind of way of perceiving the world. And we have that in our language, right? Like they're still recognized in that value of intuition, and putting the body into that is recognized in our language when you say things like follow your heart or trust your gut. Those are literal places where there's a lot of neurons and neurotransmitters, right, and brain body connections. So you're actually getting all kinds of information from those approximate areas in the body, from the gut to, if you talk about that much, but the second brain, there's
right,
about 1% of as many neurons as in the brain or in the gut. So it's very much capable of functioning autonomously of perceiving the environment. It has about 9 connections informing and sending data to the brain for every one connection going the other way. So the gut is very much a brain. Your immune system has a memory and is capable of making decisions, even though it's just floating cells in your blood. So there's all these networks that that we can kind of think of as I like to think of as kind of more like an ecosystem, that if you throw any one thing off in the body, and I include the brain as part of the body obviously, but
right,
that it can have all types of downstream other implications, right? Like you take the frogs out of a swamp, you haven't just taken the frogs out of the swamp. Like that's going to reverberate through that whole ecosystem till it finds a new balance. And so I think where somatics come in is that those often get neglected in therapy. They often just get neglected in most people's life, in their cultural experience, as we're kind of conditioned to ignore that.
Right.
Which we should always ask why.
I was about to say who benefits.
Who benefits, right? Yeah. So maybe industrial capitalism might have benefited by having you, not demand high quality food and not excessive working hours and not dangerous, poisonous working conditions. And so just ignore that body stuff.
Absolutely.
and I think that lingers. Yeah.
Yep.
So anyways, when you take a psychedelic, kind of that's one of those patterns that might get disrupted, is you're kind of ignoring and suppressing of stuff that's happening in the body. And so then people might have these strong somatic experiences of, whatever, just sensations they haven't experienced, maybe traumas, kind of the physically held aspects of traumas resurfacing, shaking, trembling, hot and cold, all sorts of things just happening in the body during those. They're usually perplexed by it because we're pretty separate from it. And this is supposed to be a psychological experience, right?
Right. What is happening?
Yeah. But that's part of it, right? So that's one super system. It's one ecosystem.
Yeah. I always think about how in animals, when you see them after they have a stressful situation, they shake. right? And
Right.
because of our conditioning of what it means to be a normal, put together human, that is not what I see most people doing after an experience of stress
Right.
or trauma, right? To shake it off or to dance or to do other things like that. And so I feel like, yeah, in that amplified state, often that is what the body wants to do, right? Is to actually quite literally like shake it out. And I know you've spoken to experiences like that where it actually completely it causes the body to shake and really release that tension in a psychedelic experience.
Yeah, and that's one of the downsides of these complex minds that we have is that the mind can kind of these constructs can overrule signals that we're getting that something's bad for us, whether that's a relationship or the state and economic system we're living under or whatever it is. Can kind of we can kind of find all sorts of ways from distracting ourselves or dismissing those feelings. And that can also get in the way of healing. And so that sometimes like your body's trying to work something out and do some healing. And we just perceive that as an unpleasant, uncomfortable symptom. We want it to stop. Much like the analogy sometimes give, like, it's uncomfortable if you have a sliver in your finger for your body to get inflamed and try to, but it's trying to push it out. And so that's why with trauma, most people will tell you, for example, that the times when those symptoms are most present is not when they're busy and stressed and going through life and occupied. It's when they try to like relax and go to sleep or something. Yeah. And your very intelligent, very well-evolved system says that if you're relaxed, the outside world must be safe at that moment, and that's a good time to work on the internal shit. Yeah. But in fact, maybe you need to go to, you just are trying to get to sleep for work the next day. So there's not room for that. Like the context doesn't allow you room for that, and then the culture hasn't told you that could be a benefit to let that work out, or to find ways to be supported and letting that work out. And so, so that's a lot of what we're doing in therapy, right? Is trying to create the container, trying to create the space where it's okay to let that stuff out and to work through it. Yeah. But obviously humans have always faced traumas and have found ways to work with them. So within the cultural context, within their relationships.
Yeah. And how beautiful that our brain, our heart, wherever we, whatever we want to refer to it as, will protect us. You're right. Like when we are in that space of continually running in survival mode, go, 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 go. You don't feel it right until you're trying to go to sleep, or until maybe some of those stressors in your life have calmed down. And then all of a sudden it starts to flood forward, right? Because, I hear people, the lack of compassion, of judgment towards self. It's remembering that your mind and your body is keeping you safe and not allowing you to go there because you are in that constant state of survival. Now is not the time. And I think we often see in the nervous system, whether that's someone's actual literally tension in the body, their tension in their breath, even how they're still holding that and trying to keep themselves safe in those situations. And I always remember in learning from you too with the somatic work is that often the benefit is to actually go deeper into the experience of the somatic.
Stay with it.
To like go into it, and then trying to talk to people about the ways that actually tuning into that experience is going to amplify it. But it is that arc, right? Of tuning in, amplifying it, and then trusting that the wave will come back down as you allow it to be there and really be present with it.
Right.
Yeah. We talk about panic attacks, right? That's, that's right there.
Yeah. Which is one of the, and we try to do it in a way that's kind of metered, that's like bit by bit rather than flooding all at once.
Right.
Partly just because we have all these ways of, distracting. And so we kind of all these coping skills and defenses. And so people will just kind of go to those reflexively and automatically if you flood them and do it too quickly. And so, so unlike the zebra who escaped the lion and can go, into the center of the herd where their body gets signals they're safe, and then they can start kicking and shaking and releasing that energy that they don't need. They still learn from it, right? Like they don't forget a lion chase them, but they integrate it, right? So they might from that day forward be more cautious and more alert to lions, but they're not carrying the fight or flight energy perpetually from that chase. Yeah. And so the learning is still there, but it's that chronic hypervigilance and fight or flight energy that causes people problems.
Absolutely. And I think of that and relational systemic issues as all being a part of diagnosis, right? And I know that you talked a little bit earlier about the ways that we're our society is trying to box and pigeonhole certain psychedelics into specific diagnoses and that treatment. Oh, Geoff, please dismantle the diagnosis for me. Let's talk about it.
All right, we might need to, I do think that psychedelics are particularly disruptive of diagnosis, again, because it'll disrupt these constructs that we create, and diagnoses are ultimately constructs we invented rather than facts that we discovered of nature
within the last 100 years.
And I think that's an important point. Yeah, is that I think the standard way of thinking about it is diagnoses are things that we have discovered that exist rather than constructs we've created to explain human experience. So it's not that the human experience isn't real; it is, but the diagnoses are just particular ways within within our cultural context that we've come to label them and describe them. But also important that diagnoses are not explanations; they're merely descriptions. So much like, but the problem is once you describe something, that tends to become the rule of how things should be experienced. So much like grammar, right? Like humans have always had language. We only recently have documented what the implicit rules of that language are in the form of grammar. Those tend to then become official rules and expectations for how the right way to speak is. And it makes the language a lot more static as a result. And I think diagnosis that way, when we create this language of a diagnostic label of like, here are symptoms that tend to co-occur together with people who are sad, we call that depression.
Right.
That was done in a particular culture. And if you'd done it from scratch in a different culture, it would have looked very different. Guarantee it would have looked very different. There are well-documented examples in cultural anthropology of how when you go try to study a diagnosis in a different culture, you have a lot of trouble finding it because it doesn't exist in the same way, if it exists at all.
Right.
So that doesn't mean the range of experiences don't exist, that people get sad in every culture. People are, have a range of emotional perception and empathy, across any culture. But to consolidate those symptoms into a diagnostic label is much more a social and political decision than it is a scientific or natural reality.
Yeah, I really appreciate the distinction of the human suffering is real.
Yes. Yeah. So there was a book by, I think, Thomas Says, The Myth of Mental Illness, which was much decades old book. I want to say set maybe in the 1970s or so. And that was much more of like a libertarian take of like personal responsibility. And so that was kind of denying a lot of mental illness. And so I'm not taking that approach. Like that's not the approach. Many other people have made the point that, human suffering is universal, but culturally, and this comes out of cultural anthropology, every culture has like what you could call a symptom pool, meaning they have ways of suffering that they can understand and that are therefore legitimized by that culture. And in this culture, it was on full display with the last edition of the DSM, which is our mental health diagnostic manual, which is that they posted the draft version online for a couple of years for public comment. So I think it was like for 2 years, really, that it was up. So professionals could comment, but so could anybody. Anybody could comment. Your comments could be citing research. Your comments could be personal opinion. Your comments could be advocacy. And so all sorts of changes were made to that diagnostic system based on people basically negotiating what they agreed to suffering looks like and doesn't look like. And so in every culture that happens, it usually doesn't happen in such a formal way as it did with the DSM.
Right.
But that's always, usually over, decades or hundreds of years, thousands of years, that's a cultural negotiation of, what does a child with a stomach ache mean? It means a different thing in different cultures. In China, it might mean as much as a kid in the United States saying they're sad and get the same attention. So those symptoms are ways of communicating about your suffering. Right. And so when we box it in with a diagnosis and say this diagnosis has these 9 symptoms, well, if your particular version of that has a few symptoms that aren't one of those 9 symptoms, the most common thing to do is ignore them. So you don't tend to those, because those are the ones that will get you labeled as crazy, kind of like dismissed, right? Or people will just say, either those aren't real or I don't know what to do about them, right? So you won't get help. You won't get help on those things that the culture doesn't recognize much. And so that's a huge limitation of like formalizing diagnosis rather than taking a broader view that if somebody tells me that they're struggling with something or suffering from something, that is automatically legitimate. We can figure out how they want to label that and describe it and what the causes are. But I really think diagnoses give us they might give us a way of a language for talking about things and make us temporarily feel understood. But if it doesn't result in relief, you probably don't feel, ultimately in the long run, you're not going to be felt understood or helped. And if you don't clearly fit that category of diagnosis, probably the systems and the helping professionals aren't going to be able to help you a whole lot, and you're going to bounce around and struggle to find the person who can help. But that all stems and starts from, I think, these rigid diagnostic categories. There's 100 other critiques too, but but aside from that, I would say the other big critique for me is that diagnoses by their nature are internal and individualistic. So if I give you a diagnosis, I'm saying that you have this problem. So it's a problem focused narrative. It's a thin narrative, just a very simple ways that we talk about it. So it loses the complexity and the context of your life because it's inside of you. It doesn't look at the rest of your context of your life and your relationships and the culture and kind of the intersections with all of that. And therefore it's kind of depoliticizes it, right? So if you're suffering from what we'd call depression diagnostically, because you're seeing all these apocalyptic scenarios in the world, escalating, nationalism and isolationism and things that would point towards risk of, wider wars or climate catastrophe or the impact of, out of control technologies like AI being really disruptive to economies, that where does that fit with a depression of diagnosis, which boils down to you're stuck in a pattern of sadness and hopelessness about it, and maybe self-criticism or whatever your particular symptoms are. And it kind of ignores all the context that might be contributing to that and says this is a thing inside of you, and therefore maybe we give you a medication to change your neurotransmitters so you don't feel that way about things. And that's kind of the end of the thinking about it, right?
And who benefits from that, right? Good question. Who benefits from that? And I appreciate I appreciate when I was, at least, I didn't get this level of critical examination of diagnostic
I didn't either.
criteria. So I was so happy to train with you in the sauna to start to be learning from this sort of critical perspective. I do remember in my trauma class, they had shown me some sort of research study about these case vignettes where it was two children, and the difference between the two were that it was a white child and a black child, and conceptualizing from diagnosis. And there was shown to be a bias of conceptualizing, despite the same, sort of vignette and story of experiences. The white child was often diagnosed with PTSD, and then the black child was often diagnosed with disruptive disorder. What is the
basically conduct disorder
disorder. So Geoff, I'm proud that I don't know all of these. I'm gonna say I'm proud to have gotten this far and be like, I don't know all of these damn terms in the book. But right, that's it was mind-boggling for me to even
disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, which was a new one. So we invent these new diagnoses too.
Exactly. And so then the bias of the clinician and the way that then creates these worlds and these paradigms, where I've definitely talked about the inter-rater reliability, right? The consistency of physicians to accurately diagnose the same person, and to learn that the inter-rater reliability for some of our major diagnoses, generalized anxiety disorder, major depression, right? To learn that was as likely as chance was pretty much the most mind-boggling experience as someone in this field. And so I know I've talked to you a lot about that, of how then do we look at data where it's all about the effectiveness of this treatment for depression, right? If the actual category itself is already so, unclear, what sort of data are we actually getting here? And to remember, what you had said at the beginning is that the suffering is real. The suffering is very real. And I think that, it's hard to see the ways that when you do get that diagnosis, of course, the individual, so then the narrative of there's something wrong with me, not there's something wrong with the systems, but also the ways that narrative then perpetuates further living into that identity. Often I see a lot of that, of like, hi, my name's this and I have that, right? And this is who I am. And so the ways that actually perpetuates it further, and especially in the world of sex and relationships, he's a narcissist, this, like, all of these different labels that are often thrown out to, I guess, again, thin narratives thin narratives that don't see the whole complexity of the ecosystem that that person was in, or even the ways that that sort of strategy of how they're showing up in relationships was adaptive at the time. And that's what we're actually seeing, is that that person was so hurt in the past that this is why they're showing up this way. But we slap something like, oh, they're a narcissist, they're horrible, it's innate in them, and we should shun them from the society. I think this is also where the conversation of anarchy could start to come into, of community and what all of this means. But yeah, it's quite the mess. And I do look at it as like a dragon to be slain, as people in the field that really need to be critical to the ways this impacts all of us.
Yeah, and that's and you mentioned something there that that these diagnoses can become part of our identity pretty naturally, and so I think for that reason, there's nothing that feels more personal than identity, and so when you start critiquing diagnosis, people I think understandably get protective about that and get defensive about that, because it feels like you're attacking part of their identity, or you're attacking the legitimacy of their suffering. And so I think it's important to say that neither of those is the case. If anything, my goal, we're using some language that comes from narrative therapy there, which I strongly want to boost. Narrative therapy is awesome. It's the most liberatory of all therapies, I think. It's the least colonial and the least oppressive of all therapies, but maybe there's a few others you'd put up there with it, but for me, it's the best in that way. So, but what they say is that we want to help thicken people's narratives about their lives and themselves. So it's about enriching identity, and so it's okay if somebody identifies as autistic, if somebody identifies as depression, that even beyond that label can provide some meaning and like a sense of understanding and maybe some hope that they can get help or something, right? So that's important. But along with that, we want to kind of move away from that's a very thin narrative that kind of like, what is depression? What is autism? It's just a handful of criteria that don't come anywhere remotely close to explaining somebody's life experience and who they are, right? Like, if anything, it's just like a piece of how they experience the world and how they feel in the world. And maybe a very important one, it might capture some very important aspects of that, and that's why it's very appealing to identify with that diagnosis. But so it's not so much about like I totally respect somebody's right to identify with those labels or any other label, whether it comes from the DSM or not. But I think the question still is like how do we thicken your narrative? How do we enrich your own understanding of the complexity of who you are and what your life experiences are? So, and in narrative therapy, they talk about externalizing rather than internalizing these labels. So they still have people kind of choose how they want to understand the problem that they're coming in with, but they're also very clear that they want to make sure that the person understands they're not the problem, that the problem is the problem, right? So if I'm anxious in social situations, that's the problem. But if I see myself as socially anxious, again, that's one of those thin narratives that's going to probably define and restrict my life in ways that I don't appreciate more than I want to. It's like, I'm somebody who used to have pretty intense social anxiety, and I still have bits of that, but also I think fortunately I kind of had some things that supported me not identifying with it, like that was an experience I was having, but it didn't mean I had to avoid certain areas of life. And so I also would call myself kind of slightly more extroverted than introverted. I think I became that way over time. I also have been a professor and presenting conferences and things, and I'm uncomfortable every time I do it. So it's like, I think when we have the thin narrative, we think like it's easy to go like these very kind of simple if then type of scenarios, like because I'm socially anxious I could not be a teacher, for example. And so rather than elaborating that narrative, I'm socially anxious, but I can warm up if I get past that initial discomfort, or I can be anxious the entire time and still do a good job, or kind of like I also have a lot of ideas that I'm good at kind of like seeing multiple angles to things. So these things that have nothing to do with that kind of give me value beyond whatever that problem is, right? So, but I think importantly, two things there: not internalizing it, seeing it as a contextual problem that I'm in relationship to, that I can relate to in different ways, and to have a thicker understanding and narrative of who I am and all the things I'm capable of, or things that are challenges for me, or all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I really appreciate this conversation because it's so deep within our cultural consciousness, that these labels are thrown around so often. I think two examples recently in my life where someone talking about how they were on TikTok, and it's so hard to be on TikTok without getting sucked into hours of being on the platform. And someone came back and said, oh, do you have ADHD? And I was like, oh no, like this is literally created to suck you in. This is not a so even that question coming from someone in the community. Or I was talking about how I've been on my website writing, guidebooks for how to work with grounding and jealousy and non-monogamy. And I had spent like a full 6 hours just writing and in the flow and thriving. And someone looked back at me, oh, do you have ADHD? Have passion, okay, but it's so within the cultural consciousness that's what you're getting constantly, where these different frames to, again, thin frames, and also a problematic
very individualistic and right, what's your deal kind of thing, right when nothing about us when in fact nothing about us is without a context, right? Like even if that narcissistic label fits somebody reasonably well, like are we curious enough to understand why, and are we curious enough to understand like how they also might be like a dedicated parent or a good employee or whatever else that would seem to contradict the narcissism? Like in what context? They're probably not, we're not the same in every context. Like we change based on the conditions changing, the different contexts that we're in, right? And I think anybody can reflect on that and know that you're not exactly the same with your best friend as you are with your parents, as you are in a classroom, as you are in a workplace, as you are on a bus, right? Like the context setting impacts all areas of our being. And
right. And of course there's a deep anarchist conversation to be had about struggling to pay attention to spreadsheets for hours, right? And then to say, oh, you have ADHD, here's here's drugs to make it through this oh whoa.
When in fact maybe you just want to get through graduate school, and if all things were equal, and if there were no power structures in place, you probably wouldn't spend 6 hours looking at a spreadsheet.
Yes. absolutely
unless you had a real passion for what was in that spreadsheet, right? So
and for me, I think this is all a part of relationship anarchy. I know when we had talked, you said you weren't as familiar with the concept, but for me, I see all of this being related because, relationship anarchy, from my understanding of it, isn't necessarily about your sexual romantic partnerships. If anything, it's actually about trying to take off the priority that we've placed in our culture so deeply on those types of relationships, and to see more of the community and the deeper ways that we are all interconnected. And so in that examination of our interconnectedness, part of that is one of the biggest pieces of that is how power structures are impacting us in our relationships. And the field of psychology, all of these pieces are so deeply impacting all of us. And so I feel like this is actually a crucial piece of the conversation of relationship anarchy, is how are the narratives of the white Western colonizer field of psychology and its recent development within the last 100 years, right? Like, how is that impacting all of us? And I think this conversation is hitting on some of the different ways that is the water that we swim in.
Yeah. Yep. And I think, right, and if it's the water we swim in, right, the only way you really can get a comprehensive view of that water is like sometimes you got to get out of the water. Like does a fish know what water is?
No.
Probably it does once it gets out of the water, then it knows what water is.
Then it dies.
Yeah. So there's this idea in anarchism, which I'm sure you're familiar with and you're certainly practicing, which is prefigurative politics. So the idea that we can create an experiment with different forms of organizations, relationships, things like that reflect the kind of society that we're hoping to build. And you may find out some of those things don't work, but you don't know until you try, right? But the idea is that if we don't kind of start living now the values in the direction of the future that we want, we won't get there, right? Because it's not it's not just a thought experiment of like I can dream up a utopian society. I guess you'd need some dictator to implement it if you came up with that on your own, right?
Yeah.
And so the idea of prefigurative politics kind of takes out that power element and says, we want people experimenting with living in different ways so that we can see how that works, and so that people can find what works for them, and we're not all going to be the same. But if we can kind of discover what the range of possibilities are, then then if we kind of take away the power structures like borders and things that would prevent people from being able to freely move between those different societies, then maybe we'd all, have a little bit easier time finding our place in the world.
Yeah, the power of seeing a different possibility, a
Mm-hmm.
different dream, imagination, and trying to do our best to both work within the systems and against them at the same time. And I was reminded of when I had first started training at Sana. I remember coming to the table and saying, someone had asked me if I'm an anarchist, but I don't even know. And you had looked at me and said, you have this whole podcast on it, Nicole. And I was like, yeah, but I don't know enough yet, And I think it's been definitely a process over the years of continuing to study and learn from this specific, framework to dreaming. Mm-hmm. And so it's definitely something that I've continued to learn about and what it means to actually live into the value systems of anarchy.
Yeah, and we probably all have, anybody who is interested in that system has their entry point, right? And so for you, maybe it was more relationships. For me, it was cross-cultural research. So just, there's that anarchist saying that I think gets attributed to David Graeber, another world is possible. And so for me, studying other cultures made me realize like, oh man, there's almost nothing about how we do things, how we see ourselves, how we experience the world that is universal, that that culture could kind of program that in any direction. And that's not a problem. It's a problem when the cultures become rigid and monocultural, and movement, is difficult for all these bureaucratic and political reasons, like, kind of things that get in the way of you, I don't know, experimenting and building a new type of school because you have ideas about how kids might learn better, but you're kind of restricted legally in all these ways, right? Or borders prevent us from moving very easily. And so less so for Americans who are very privileged than for, people in developing countries who are unlikely to be able to travel much. Not just for financially, because they won't get a visa to wealthier countries. So there's all these barriers so culture is not the problem. It's when culture is too homogenous and it's too difficult to move, and there's too many things that you're required to participate in that kind of trap you, right? Like we all gotta pay taxes, that sort of thing, that we all need to meet our basic needs. And there are things like, zoning and building codes that define where you can grow your own food and whether you can forage, and what, whether you can build your own house, and what the rules are that kind of make everything very complex and expensive and restrictive, and that kind of restrict the possibilities of, but that's one of the things I appreciate from anarchism, is the idea that humans made everything and could just as easily make them differently. That's also a David Graeber paraphrase, but so that to me is really inspiring, and that was kind of my into anarchism. But I share that with you. I'm like, then the areas that I hadn't thought about as much, I'm trying to piece together and understand.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, another world is possible. That creativity, that flexing of that muscle. And yeah, definitely for me, doing the work that I did, volunteering as a sexual assault counselor, and then just deep diving into sex positivity. I think that's where you're right. Like my touch point was relationships and sexuality, of another world is possible. And then I think, like you're saying in anarchy, not to become then a monolith of one way of being, which I know that we've, in my own supervision processed a lot of that identity formation of the difficulties of when you have fought so hard, like psychedelics, like kink, in these ways where you fought so hard to be seen, and then you want everybody to be here, versus understanding the importance of diversity, right? And so I often see that a lot, even in the relationship anarchy research that I've continued to do on my podcast. I've gotten some people who have responded, say, I'm anti-monogamy, I'm anti this, I'm anti all this. And I'm like, whoa, do you understand how you're reinforcing the power structures that we are trying to get out of? I understand your examination of the power and the consciousness and creating more space, but we have to be so careful in these ways of still understanding and respecting the diversity of experience and the different lives that people are going to create.
Yeah. And I understand, much like the fish out of water, right? Like the anti
water.
The anti can be an important phase in breaking free of an old construct, right? So like if you're really getting into polyamory, I think it makes sense to go through a period of being anti-monogamy. Otherwise, and you may not always be, right? Too. Like I think it's always worth remembering that things are contextual, and so likely when you first start exploring that, you don't get much support, and you get a lot of pushback from people in your life. And and from the culture in general. And so you might have to kind of go anti in the same way that, like, if we look at, like, racial identity development models, for example,
Right.
like there's an important phase of, like, you go from, like, probably being, and those are centered, or we'll say, around people of color. There are white racial identity models too, but I'm thinking about the people of color ones. It kind of goes from, like, at some point you're too young to really perceive racism or know that it exists, and might be oblivious to it. And then at some point you have a critical experience that highlights it for you, that it's, obvious enough that it's not just your deficit, but that there's this prejudice in the world. And then from there, like, the next natural stage to go into is kind of like immersion in your own group and kind of anti the majority group. And so I view it as like and then eventually people might, not need to be so immersed in it once they've gotten solid in their understanding of themselves and their experience. So, but it's not a linear thing either. So then if you get to face some discrimination, you might kind of need to go back and immerse yourself in your group for kind of safety and protecting your own sense of self. And that's not a failure or a retreat. It's just kind of a natural reaction to the context.
Of course.
But I think that way with everything. Is like, I think anytime you're experimenting with something new, you might need to be very anti the old thing.
Yeah, I can definitely see myself in that journey of having to have the claws out to protect yourself because society is so set otherwise. And I think that it's been a really, speaking about community and healing, just training with you and everybody at Sauna Healing Collective had been such like a breath of fresh air to be able to be all that I am and not have to be afraid to be judged, or that somehow, the ways that I was living my life were wrong, but rather to see them as something that could specifically have a cultural understanding, right? To be something that could be helpful. And, as I've closed out my training with you guys, it's been so radical to have almost half of my caseload practicing polyamory and non-monogamy. I can't even describe to you what sort of identity formation that has given to me from first coming in, of feeling like, oh, no one does this. I feel like I'm so bad and I'm doing something so radical, to having this full caseload and supporting people. It's just made it so much more real and tangible. Like some of the first books I had found on it made it feel more real and not just this dream. And so I think that, again, part of this comes back to the healing of community, really.
Yeah. I'm very happy we were able to support that as well. So, yeah. And that's what we're trying to do from top to bottom. That's, we want each person who works there to be able to pursue the things that are passionate. And we're still existing within these structures of insurance and state and reimbursement and all that shit, and money for that matter. But so there's some things you can get free of and some things you can't. But if we can, as much as we can, do that prefigurative politics thing where we kind of live as if or live toward the world that we're wanting, that's important. So we try to do that, for the clients, to really respect their autonomy pretty radically, and get them to reflect on the cultural and contextual things that influence their lives, not just their internal experience. And I think psychedelics help with that a lot, because they kind of break up these structures and temporarily anyway, they disrupt these structures and help us see things in a different way and help us notice where things are out of balance. And it's like, actually, I'm not feeling great about this norm in society. I'm not feeling great about my work. And you already weren't, but it makes you more aware of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It brings attention to it. Yeah. From there, we make decisions. So like, from there, even if somebody decides to stay in that job, at least there's more of a sense of, kind of weighing your options and deciding to do it versus just kind of being totally stuck there.
Yeah. Yes, definitely. And I'm thinking about the ways too in which creating this world, the other world, and I know this is way too big of a question, but I'm going to ask it anyways. If you were to impart any wisdom, perspective to the listeners of how you can do that in your day-to-day life, and trusting in the ripples of the ways that we show up in our relationships and our community, is there anything that you would impart with them of how we could take at least a little step towards that world? I know that's a big question, so it's too big, but I'm throwing it out there anyways.
Yeah, I think there's a million little steps. And so we are both created by, and we are recreators of the world, right? And so if we think of that every day and the things that we do that we do things that kind of support the status quo and reinforce this world, and a lot of those things you kind of have to do, because there's ultimately the end point of like why we stay in line is the threat of state violence is the end point of everything, and even minor things, right? So it's like try driving around with no license plates on your car and see what happens if you don't comply and put a license. Eventually, you end up in jail, right? So eventually, it's the violence of the state that gets imposed on you, even for these little mundane bureaucratic things.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think in many other ways, even if there are things that we can't so easily rebel against, like license plates, right. that there are 1,000 possible little acts of rebellion where you can kind of diverge in some way, big or small, from the status quo. And I think those are the things that over time make culture. We don't make culture in one big shot. Or I mentioned like utopias, right? Like we can dream up a utopia. If you had the power to enact your utopia, I hope you wouldn't do it. Because that would be authoritarianism, and right. wouldn't work for a lot of people. So culture needs to emerge over time through kind of our collective decisions and actions. And so you contribute to that in little ways every single day, that you do things just a little bit different. So whether you ask, somebody a more personal question that is appropriate for your corporate office space for the sake of connecting with them, that's a breaching of that. Whether you use all your vacation days and maybe use them to kind of break from your normal life pattern, whatever that looks like. That's kind of a capitalistic example of it, but
sure.
But that doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to mean consuming a bunch during that vacation. Whether you plant a garden or get together with your neighbors and plant a community garden, or kind of like I think that's particularly important. What are the ways that you network and connect with other people in new ways? Where that's been one of the primary strategies, I think, of keeping people in line is to kind of pit us against each other in competition and separate us and kind of destabilize communities. Because what happens when people are kind of stable in a place together, they start forming culture, they start building things, and they start doing those things that are kind of sometimes in conflict with the state, sometimes supplant and replace what the state thinks it should have domain over, like taking care of immigrants, for example, or new immigrants. And so diverging from some things, and particularly diverging from things in a way that allows you to kind of engage in some mutual aid with other people. I think those are the most subversive, the ways we engage in mutual aid together, the way that we kind of build things for ourselves that meet our needs, that contributes towards our freedom. That also helps us build the skill set we would actually need to live autonomously, which is a very de-skilled country. Which I think is strategic, that the wealthiest countries are the most de-skilled. We've kind of moved labor largely out of them, that you actually become more dependent on the state. And less likely to overthrow it. So I think developing new skills. So I mentioned gardening, but also, do you know how to repair or make clothing? Do you know how to repair or vehicle or bike, or kind of other things that we important tools?
Yeah, definitely.
Tools.
Yep. I think one that was coming to mind too for me is the power of listening, right? Not, oh, I'm just listening to someone. No, the power of actually being present, listening, and witnessing someone in that, and in our relationships, and just how much that can change the world if we were actually listening to one another, not always trying to have the next part of the conversation figured out, right? But to actually just, I hear you and I see you. I'd be curious what sort of world even that level of a small act could ripple out to our collective consciousness and connection.
Yeah, I think especially when we listen within a group and you start to kind of hear, oh, maybe me and a bunch of other people are having similar concerns and problems, and it's not just my personal deficit, but it's the unrealistic demands and stressors that the society as it's currently organized is putting on all of us.
Consciousness raising.
Yeah.
Well, Geoff, as we come towards the end of our time today, I'm going to take a deep breath with you again. And I want to check in to see, before we go towards a closing question, are there any last words that you would want to impart with the listeners? Otherwise, I can guide us towards our closing question.
Yeah, to sum it up, another world is possible.
And
thank God none of us has the power or the responsibility to do that on our own. So.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, Geoff, the last question that I ask everyone on the podcast is, what is one thing that you wish other people knew was more normal?
I wish people knew that almost everything is normal. I think that's been one of the best gifts of being a therapist and having access to people's minds is that any wild thought or idea or impulse I've ever had, a lot of people have had the same thing, and so we take the experience we have in the world, even our identity, way too personally when they're much more impersonal than we think they are. So I wish people knew it was normal to be different and to not be like other people. It would be abnormal to be average in every way.
Yeah, absolutely. I've always joked on the podcast that I know I have a true anarchist when they absolutely say no to this question and say that all things are normal, just disrupt and challenge the question. I'm like, that's the anarchist check. They have passed if there was a test.
One of my all-time favorite quotes, I think it was Alfred Adler said, the only normal people are the ones you don't know very well.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Geoff, it's been such a joy to have you on the podcast. It's been such a joy to have you in my community and to be able to share this space with you and all the listeners today. So I really appreciate you coming onto the show.
All right. Thank you. It was fun.
Yeah. And before you go to, I do want to invite you to plug away. Where can listeners who are interested in your research, interested in Sauna Healing Collective, where can they find you and all your work?
If you want to find my research, easy enough just to type my my rare last name into Google Scholar, and you'll find out anything I've written academically. And then sanahealingcollective.org, SANA. healingcollective.org is a website where we also tend to link to some of that stuff. And even if you're not local to Chicago or the Chicago region, sometimes do online trainings and events or integration groups or things like that, always with a sliding scale based on need as well. So check us out and see what's out there.
Yeah, and I'll have all of that linked below for the listeners to click away and find all of your content. And so, thank you for joining me, and thank you for building community with me here.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. If you enjoyed today's episode, then leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcast. And head on over to modernanarchypodcast.com to get resources and learn more about all the things we talked about on today's episode. I want to thank you for tuning in, and I will see you all next week.